Somewhere inside the royal archives at Windsor Castle, there is a file. It belongs to Princess Louise, the sixth child of Queen Victoria, a woman who was born in 1848 and died in 1939, who lived through the entirety of the Victorian era, 2 world wars, and the transformation of Britain from the most powerful empire on earth into something altogether more uncertain. That file is closed. Not restricted in the way that some sensitive government records are restricted, accessible after a fixed number of years once the relevant parties are safely dead. Closed. Indefinitely. The files of Victoria's other 8 children have been opened and studied and cited and written about. Louise's personal records, alone among her siblings, remain sealed. Historians who have tried to access them have been refused. Biographers have written around the gaps, working from letters and diaries held in other collections, from newspaper reports and court gossip, from the accounts of those who knew her, and the occasional document that escaped whatever careful sorting happened after her death. The picture that emerges is vivid and fascinating, and incomplete. The question is not simply what is in that file. The question is why, more than 80 years after her death, someone has decided that the world is still not ready to know. Princess Louise Caroline Alberta was the most unconventional member of the most conventional family in the world. She was the first British princess in 356 years to marry a commoner. She was a professional sculptor at a time when women were not supposed to be professional anything. She fought her mother, her family, and the entire apparatus of Victorian royal expectation for the right to live as herself. And she won, more often than anyone around her intended. And yet her file is closed. This is her story, as much of it as we are allowed to know. Princess Louise Caroline Alberta was born at 8 o'clock in the morning on the 18th of March 1848 at Buckingham Palace, the 6th of 9 children of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. She arrived at a moment when the world outside the palace was in considerable upheaval. 1848 was the year of revolutions across Europe, of barricades in Paris and Vienna and Berlin, of a continent renegotiating the terms of power. None of that turbulence penetrated the royal nursery, but it was, perhaps, an appropriate moment for the arrival of a child who would spend her entire life renegotiating the terms of her own existence. She was described from early childhood as the most beautiful of Victoria's daughters, dark-haired and fine-featured, with an energy and restlessness that her more placid siblings did not share. She was curious, irreverent, and frequently difficult. She broke rules that had not needed to be rules because none of the other children had thought to break them. She said things that were not said. She asked questions that were not asked. Her father, Prince Albert, who had designed the royal children's education with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything else, had created a system that Louise later described in terms that leave no room for ambiguity. The habit of moulding all children to the same pattern, she said. It was deplorable. I know because I suffered from it. Albert died in December 1861, when Louise was 13. His death devastated the royal family and sent Victoria into a grief so consuming and so public that it would define her reign for decades. For Louise, the loss of her father was also the beginning of a new and unwelcome role. Victoria, withdrawing from public life, increasingly relied on her daughters to fill the gaps her absence created. One by one, as they came of age, the older girls married and left. Louise, by the late 1860s, found herself in the position of unofficial secretary to her mother, managing correspondence, attending functions, serving as a visible royal presence at a time when the Queen herself had largely disappeared from public view. She was good at it. She was capable and intelligent and possessed of the kind of practical energy that gets things done. But she was also, with increasing urgency, aware that this was not the life she wanted. She wanted to make things. She had always wanted to make things. Louise's interest in art had been evident since childhood, encouraged initially by her father, who was himself a capable amateur artist and who understood the value of creative work in a way that Victorian convention did not always endorse. She sketched, she painted, she modelled in clay with a seriousness that went beyond the accomplishments a princess was expected to display. This was not the polite dabbling of a well-bred girl. This was genuine talent, pursued with genuine commitment. In 1863, Queen Victoria did something that, by the standards of her world, was quietly remarkable. She permitted Louise to enroll at the National Art Training School in South Kensington, which later became the Royal College of Art. Louise became one of the first members of the royal family to attend a public educational institution and to train as a professional artist alongside people who were not royal, who were not aristocratic, who were simply students pursuing their craft. The world she entered was the world of the aesthetic movement and the pre-Raphaelites, a world that valued beauty and individual expression over conventional morality and social propriety. Louise moved through it with evident delight. She befriended artists and thinkers and reformers, people whose ideas about how women should live and what women were capable of were considerably more expansive than those she had grown up with. She became close to women who were campaigning for access to education, to medicine, to the vote. She corresponded with Josephine Butler, who was fighting for the rights of women trapped in prostitution by poverty and circumstance. She visited Elizabeth Garrett, the first woman in Britain to qualify as a physician. These were not conventional friendships for a princess. Victoria was not entirely comfortable with them, but Louise pursued them anyway, with the same stubborn persistence she brought to everything she had decided mattered. As a sculptor, she was genuinely accomplished. Her work was not merely the competent production of a well-tutored amateur. She submitted work to exhibitions under conditions that required it to be judged on merit rather than on the identity of its maker. The critics who reviewed her sculptures without knowing who had made them were, by and large, impressed. The statue of Queen Victoria that she sculpted, which stands today on the grounds of Kensington Palace, is a serious work by a serious artist. It has stood there for over a century, the daughter's vision of the mother, immovable. She was a princess who made things that lasted. In a family where women were expected to be ornamental, she insisted on being useful. The distinction mattered to her enormously. By the late 1860s, the question of Louise's marriage had become pressing. She was the last of Victoria's older daughters still unmarried, and the conventions of the time were unambiguous on the subject. Princesses married. They married other royals, they moved to foreign courts, they carried the British royal bloodline into the dynasties of Europe and secured the diplomatic connections that the monarchy depended on. This was the pattern. Every one of her sisters had followed it. Louise had no intention of following it. Various candidates were proposed. The Crown Prince of Denmark, Prince Albert of Prussia, the Prince of Orange. Louise found reasons to object to all of them, reasons that were sometimes practical and sometimes simply the unadorned objection of a woman who had decided that she was not going to spend her life in a foreign court, speaking a foreign language, making the best of a marriage she had not chosen. She had watched her sisters do exactly that. She had seen enough of it to know that it was not what she wanted. What she wanted was to stay in England, to continue her work, to live in a world where her friendships and her art were accessible to her, not sacrificed to the requirements of a dynasty that needed her primarily as a diplomatic asset. And then, at one of William Gladstone's famous political breakfasts, she met John Campbell, Marquis of Lorne, heir to the Dukedom of Argyll. He was Scottish, handsome, literary, and interested in the arts. He was not a royal. He was not even, by the strict hierarchy of European courts, the kind of aristocrat that a princess was expected to consider. He was a commoner, in the technical sense that mattered enormously in Louise's world. No child of a British monarch had married a commoner since 1515, when Henry VIII's sister Mary had married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Louise fell in love with him. Her brother, the future Edward VII, objected strenuously. The Prussian royal court was offended. Various members of the extended royal family expressed their disapproval through the established channels of royal disapproval, which is to say through letters and pointed silences and conversations that were reported back to Victoria. Victoria gave her approval. She liked Lorne. She liked that the marriage would keep Louise in England. She liked, perhaps, that her most difficult daughter had found someone she actually wanted to marry rather than someone she had been assigned. On the 3rd of October 1870, they became engaged at Balmoral. On the 21st of March 1871, they married at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The crowds who came to see the wedding were enormous. The public had always had a particular affection for Louise, responding to something in her that was warmer and more human than the formal royal image usually projected. She had been the princess who actually seemed to be present in the world rather than above it. Now she had done something unprecedented, and the public approved entirely. The marriage between Louise and Lorne was, from the beginning, something other than what it appeared. This much is established by historians, even without access to the closed files. They did not have children, in a period when childlessness in a marriage was almost universally understood as a failure of some kind, even when it was not. The reasons for this childlessness have never been definitively established. Various explanations have been offered, none of them fully satisfying. What is clear is that the marriage functioned for much of its duration through the mechanism of separation. They spent long periods apart. Not the ordinary separations of a busy Victorian couple with different social obligations, but extended, purposeful separations that gave both of them the space to live lives that did not quite fit the domestic ideal their public image projected. Lorne was appointed Governor-General of Canada in 1878, and Louise went with him. She was vice-regal consort from 1878 to 1883, living in Ottawa and travelling extensively through a country that was large and cold and entirely unlike anything she had grown up with. She made the best of it, in the way she made the best of most things she had not chosen. She promoted the arts, helped to found the National Gallery of Canada, supported the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. She brought her sculptor's eye to a country that was still deciding what it wanted to look like, and helped to give it some of the visual language it needed. She was also, for much of the time, deeply unhappy. The climate disagreed with her. Ottawa, which was then a relatively small and provincial town, offered very little of the artistic and intellectual life she had built for herself in London. She was far from the friendships and the studios and the world that nourished her. She endured it with the same composure she brought to everything she was required to endure. And she came home in 1883 and did not go back. In Canada, a province had been named after her, Alberta, and a lake of exceptional cold beauty in the Rocky Mountains bore her name as well, Lake Louise. The country she had found so difficult had given her two of the most lasting monuments anyone could ask for, carved not in bronze, but in geography. Back in England, the marriage continued in its particular way. Louise pursued her art and her friendships and her causes. Lorne pursued his own interests, which were literary and political, and which took him in directions that were not always compatible with a conventional domestic life. They were apart more than they were together. They were, by many accounts, genuinely fond of each other in the way that two people can be fond of each other when they are not making impossible demands on each other's nature. They reconciled more formally in 1911, after years of the particular distance that had come to define their arrangement. Lorne died in 1914. Louise was devastated. Whatever the marriage had been, it had been hers. He had been her choice, the choice she had made against every expectation and every convention, and his death left a gap that she did not easily fill. Of all the things that make Princess Louise exceptional, the one that most demands attention is the one that cannot fully be addressed. Her personal files in the Royal Archives at Windsor remain closed. This is not a standard archival restriction. It is a specific, continuing decision to keep her record sealed, long after the deaths of everyone who knew her, and long after the period during which such sensitivity might have a practical justification. Historians who have written about her have noted this fact with varying degrees of frustration. Lucinda Hawksley, who wrote the most comprehensive recent biography of Louise, found herself repeatedly blocked when trying to access archives that should, by any reasonable expectation, have been available to her. The biography she produced, working around the gaps with considerable skill, is rich and detailed, and clearly incomplete in ways that were not of her choosing. What the closed files might contain is a matter of historical speculation, and it would be dishonest to present that speculation as fact. What can be said is that Louise's life contained elements that would have been, by Victorian standards, deeply problematic. The childless marriage, the long separations, the unconventional friendships, the persistent rumors, circulating even in her own lifetime, of relationships that went beyond the boundaries of Victorian propriety. Some of these rumors are specific enough to have been written about by her contemporaries. Others exist only as the kind of persistent whisper that attaches itself to any public figure whose private life is known to be more complicated than their public image. Without access to the primary sources, it is impossible to say with confidence what is true and what is embellishment. That is precisely the problem. What is not in doubt is this: Louise was the most interesting of Victoria's daughters by a considerable margin. She was the one who pushed hardest against the constraints of her world, who demanded the most from her own life, who was least willing to accept the diminished version of herself that royal convention required. The idea that her archives would be entirely uncontroversial, that there would be nothing in them worth protecting, strains credulity. The decision to keep them closed is itself a kind of statement. Someone decided, and continues to decide, that whatever is in those files should not be seen. That decision tells its own story, even if we cannot yet read the one it is protecting. Victoria died in January 1901. The world that had shaped Louise, the world of the palace schoolroom and the strict routine and the suffocating expectation, simply ended. Louise stepped into the new reign of her brother, Edward VII, with something that must have felt, after so many years of her mother's watchful disapproval, like relief. She was 52 years old. She had another 38 years to live. The Edwardian era suited her. Edward's court was warmer, less formal, more interested in art and ideas and the social world than Victoria's court had been. Louise moved through it with ease, finally at home in the public life of the monarchy in a way she had never quite been during her mother's reign. She attended exhibitions and openings and events. She used her position to support causes she believed in, including women's education and women's suffrage, which she advocated for with a conviction that was rooted in a lifetime of experience of what it cost women to be excluded from the things they were capable of. She lived through the First World War, which dismembered the European royal family she had grown up in and killed a generation of young men in the mud of Flanders. She lived through the death of Edward VII and the reign of George V, through the abdication crisis that she witnessed as an old woman who had seen enough of history to understand exactly what was being broken. She lived through the beginning of the Second World War. She died on the 3rd of December 1939 at Kensington Palace, the palace she had grown up in, at the age of 91. She was the longest-lived of all Victoria's children, outlasting her nearest sibling by more than a decade. The woman who had been called the most difficult of the royal daughters, the one who pushed and argued and refused and demanded, was also the one who lasted the longest. There is something characteristic about that. She was buried at Frogmore in Windsor, among the rest of her family, in the ground that Victorian royalty had made their own. The statue she sculpted of her mother still stands outside Kensington Palace. The province of Alberta still carries her name. Lake Louise still reflects the mountains above it in the cold Canadian light. And her file is still closed. Every year, millions of people visit Kensington Palace. They come for the gardens, for the exhibitions, for the history contained within those walls. And as they approach the entrance, almost all of them walk past a bronze statue that stands in the grounds. A figure of Queen Victoria, seated in full royal regalia, composed and commanding, every inch the monarch she was for 63 years. Most of them glance at it. Some of them photograph it. Almost none of them know who made it. The sculptor was Princess Louise, Victoria's 6th child, the most difficult daughter, the one who fought for the right to be an artist and won. She made that statue, shaped it in clay and cast it in bronze, and it has stood outside the palace where she grew up for over a century, visited by millions of people who walk past without knowing that the woman they have just been reading about is the reason it exists. There is something about that image that captures Louise entirely. The daughter who argued most with her mother, who pushed against every constraint Victoria imposed, who refused every marriage Victoria preferred, who spent years as her unofficial secretary and emerged from that service determined to live as something other than a royal convenience, made her mother's image and placed it where the world could see it. Not as an act of submission, as an act of craft. She was an artist. Her mother was her subject. The bronze endures. She finished the statue in 1893, and it was unveiled to considerable acclaim. Victoria attended the unveiling. Whatever had passed between them over the decades, whatever arguments and silences and mutual exasperations had accumulated, they stood together that day in the grounds of Kensington Palace and looked at what Louise had made. No record survives of what Victoria said. Perhaps some things do not need to be said. Shortly after her death, her personal papers and correspondence were gathered and placed in the Royal Archives at Windsor. And at some point in that process, a decision was made. Her files would not be open to researchers. Not after 20 years, not after 50, not after the deaths of everyone who had known her. Indefinitely closed. Every other file in that archive relating to Victoria's children has been examined and published and cited. Louise's alone remains sealed. The reason given, when a reason is given at all, is that the contents are sensitive. Sensitive to whom, and in what way, and by whose judgment, is not explained. Historians have continued to write about her, working from the documents that escape the sorting, from letters held in other collections, from the accounts of her contemporaries. The picture they have assembled is vivid and incomplete. A woman who made things. A woman who fought for the right to make things. A woman who married the man she chose and built a life around the work she believed in, and lived long enough to see the world change almost beyond recognition from the one she had been born into. Whatever else is in that file, whatever the keepers of the archive have decided the world is not yet ready to see, this much is certain. Louise was the most interesting of Victoria's daughters. She was the one who pushed hardest and lasted longest. somewhere in those sealed boxes at Windsor is the rest of her story. Perhaps one day someone will decide it is time to open them. Perhaps the decision will never be made. Her file is still closed. Her statue is still standing. And now, at least, you know her name. If her story has stayed with you, please share it. Subscribe to History Roadshow if you have not already. Thank you for watching.